Section 1. You will hear a conversation at a left luggage office at an airport. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 10. You will see that there is a card that is related to the conversation. On this occasion only, the conversation relating to this card will be played first.
Hello, how can I help you?
I'd like to leave these bags with you if that's possible.
Certainly. How many in total?
A passenger wants to leave some luggage, so luggage receipt has been written. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10.
Hello, how can I help you?
I'd like to leave these bags with you if that's possible.
Certainly. How many in total?
3, please. How much will that be?
It's $55 for a large suitcase and $35 for a small one.
Seems expensive. How long for?
That's per 24 hours. And the current time is 15:30.
I see. Okay, that's good. My flight leaves at 6:30 tomorrow.
Are they your bags? The ones over there?
Yes, I've got 2 large ones and a small.
That's fine. What name is it?
Lewis McTominay. That's LOUISMCTOMINAY.
Thank you. Have you got any ID?
Here's my passport.
Thanks very much. And your flight number tomorrow?
AH569.
569. Thank you. Now, do you have a contact phone number?
Yes, it's a New Zealand number, so 6452 947 2407.
Where are you staying?
With friends downtown. Do you want the address?
If you give me the zip code, I can find it.
Right, let me see. Here we are. The zip code is 94102.
And the street?
Hayes Street. Hayes.
What number are you staying at?
Let me see. 580 Hayes Street. Apartment 304.
That's fine. So you can leave them here until 3:30 tomorrow. That's a total of $145. How would you like to pay?
Visa card?
There you go. Pop in your PIN number. Here's your receipt. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
That is the end of Section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Section 2. You will hear a travel company representative give a brief overview of New Zealand. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 13. Listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 13.
Okay, is that everyone? Has everyone slept well? No jet lag? Anyway, welcome. Naumai. I am sure you're going to have a great tour of the country, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview to put everything you're going to see into perspective. As you know, we are currently on the South Island in the city of Christchurch. There are 3 main islands: North Island, where we're going next week, South Island, where we are now, and the much smaller Stewart Island, down here on the map. Only about 400 people live on Stewart Island. The vast majority, 3.7 million, live on the North Island, with about 1 million on the South Island. Now, as you have probably heard, New Zealand is known as one of the last land masses in the world to be inhabited by humans. The first to arrive were the Maori, who came by boat from islands in the Pacific. They arrived towards the end of the 13th century and settled on both main islands over the next 500 years, until the Europeans arrived in numbers at the end of the 18th century. Although it is commonly thought that Captain Cook from Britain was the first European here, the country was first sighted by a Dutch explorer, Abel Tasman, in 1642. He mapped a lot of the coastline and named it New Zealand, after a province of Holland called Zeeland. Cook came on 3 separate trips and was the first person to circumnavigate the whole country and prove it was not part of Australia. He first visited in 1769 and died in Hawaii soon after his 3rd visit in 1779.
Before you hear the rest of the speech, you have some time to look at questions 14 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 14 to 20.
Over the next 30 to 40 years, many European ships visited New Zealand and traded with the local Maoris, offering them tools and guns in return for water, fresh food, and wood. These ships brought hunters who came in search of whales and seals, amongst other things. During the same period, Europeans from many different countries settled, but it was Britain who decided to try and make the country part of the British Empire. The next key date is 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed on February 6th. This was an agreement between the Maori chiefs, around 500 signed it, and the British government. It made New Zealand part of the British Empire in return for protection from other countries. As you'll discover during your stay here, not everyone thinks it was a completely fair agreement. The population of immigrants from Europe continued to grow, and the New Zealand Parliament was founded in 1854. Between the 1840s and 1870s, there were a number of battles between the British and the Maori, usually over land which was taken by the British, and ever since there have been numerous attempts to repay the Maori for land which was taken from them. One reason for the arrival of large numbers in the 1860s was the discovery of gold. The subsequent gold rush brought so many people here that Dunedin, down here on the South Island, became the largest city in the country for a few years. After the gold rush, people stayed and took up other trades such as fishing, logging, mining, and farming. It is well recorded that a massive number of native trees were cut down to make housing, fencing, and ships. This was so destructive that only about 1% of the original trees remain. For about 40 years, Auckland was the capital of the country, but in 1869, it was decided to make Wellington the capital as it's in a more central position, at the bottom of the North Island, but only a short distance across to the South Island. Although we were one of the last countries to be inhabited, we were very progressive and were the first country in the world to give the vote to women in 1893. In the 20th century, New Zealand was a very active country for such a small population. They developed refrigeration techniques so they could transport dairy products and meat. They took part in both world wars and in 1953, it was a New Zealander, Edmund Hillary, who was the first man to climb Mount Everest along with his guide, Sherpa Tenzing. A New Zealander, Rutherford, was a pioneer in atomic physics, and another New Zealander, Peter Jackson, made one of the most successful movie franchises ever in The Lord of the Rings. New Zealand also developed extreme sports like bungee jumping, and, as you know, the All Blacks are the best rugby team in the world. Over the next couple of weeks, you will see many of the places I have mentioned, and I hope that gives you an idea of the flavor of New Zealand. And now, talking of flavor, let's sit down to some nice New Zealand lamb.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Section 3. Listen to a discussion between two teachers and a student about the content of an induction course at a college. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Thanks for coming, both of you. It's great to have some input from a student into our course program.
Well, she did get the best marks last semester, so she should be able to make some good suggestions.
Thanks. I will try. Last semester was good, but I agree it is a good idea to have an induction week at the start. What is the main aim of the week?
That's a great place to start. I think we all feel that not all of the students benefited as much from the course as they could have done, and we think that's probably because they weren't ready for certain parts.
So we thought that next semester it would be good to have the first week just to get everyone ready. A sort of orientation week, particularly for the international students.
Domestic and international, actually, Becky. Don't forget we had just as many international students pass as domestic, despite the fact the whole course is done in English.
What percentage passed in the end?
About 65, and we'd like to increase that to 70 this time.
So what are we going to do in week 1?
Well, the first thing will be a day on study skills. How to do research, how to take notes, and how to organise your materials so that everything is accessible.
That sounds like a great idea. We could have done with that.
Another thing we want is a visit to the library. One of the library staff has offered to show the students around in small groups so they understand what there is and how to use it efficiently.
I agree with that. Some of our classmates never went there. They did all their research online.
Which is a pity. Proper research involves looking through real books and taking notes, at least in my opinion.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
OK, so we've got study skills and a visit to the library. What else are we going to include?
I think we need a session on referencing. How and when to write references and how to deal with citation. What do you think, Carla?
Again, we could have done with that earlier in the semester. A couple of the tutors expected us to know how to do it, and not many of us did. I think it's pretty important.
So how long would we need? A couple of hours?
Minimum. Let's say 2 90-minute sessions in the week. Now, what about time management? Professor Dawson from the business school says he'd be delighted to run a session for us. He does a lot of work with senior managers and company directors, and he's got some great tools to show. You know, ways to monitor how you spend your time, and how to decide what is more important than other things.
That sounds really good. Anything about working in groups? That would be useful.
That's a great idea. We hadn't thought of that, had we, Andrew? But in fact, a lot of the coursework has to be researched and presented in groups, so that might be very useful.
Yes, particularly for some of the international students who aren't used to working with other students.
I know exactly what you mean. How about a session on presentations as well?
That would be great. Their first assignment is week 4, and they have to present as a group. A lot of them were pretty awful last semester. Poor slides, too many words, not very good body language and so on. So yes, that would be great. Anything else?
A session on IT is always useful. How to use the learning management system and so on.
That makes sense. Who's going to be running these sessions, by the way?
Becky and I will do most of them, but we were going to ask some of this semester's top students to come and talk about the course from a student's point of view.
And did you have anybody in mind?
Well, since you're here...
I'd be happy to. I could ask Lisa as well, particularly as she's an international student.
Great.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Section 4. You will hear a lecture on a business topic. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 35. Listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 35.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest lecture on business for the general public, where we try to entertain you and inform you about key business topics. As part of our series on marketing this week, we will be looking at branding, the names companies use, and the values we associate with them. Today's lecture will focus on reinvention. I have divided my talk into 4 sections, and I will look at different companies in each one. Let's start with one of the most famous companies in the world and with one of the most well-known logos, as you can see on this slide. Shell is famous as an oil company selling petroleum products to a huge number of people all over the world. The company is Anglo-Dutch, the result of Royal Dutch Petroleum and Shell Oil merging in the early 20th century. Today, the company owns massive oil tankers which transport the crude oil direct from the oil fields to the refineries. Shell invests millions of dollars trying to find oil, and when they find it, trying to extract it. Yet, 150 years ago, Shell was a small shop in London which sold shells, exactly as the name and the logo suggest. They imported them from Southeast Asia and sold them to collectors. The shop was run by a man called Marcus Samuel, and when his sons took over the business, they expanded into a more general import-export company. Their ships sailed to Southeast Asia full of tools, machinery, textiles and other products made in Britain, and returned with rice, china and silk. Towards the end of the 19th century, the invention of the motor car created a large market for oil, and the Shell Company was the first to build a ship specially designed to carry oil. Before that, oil was carried in barrels, but in 1892 the first oil tanker was launched. From then on, the Samuel brothers became a major player in the oil business and in 1897 renamed their company Shell Transport and Trading. During the 20th century, they became more and more involved in the petroleum business, and Shell is now one of the names you associate immediately with exploration, drilling, and trading in oil.
Before you hear the rest of the lecture, you have some time to look at questions 36 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 36 to 40.
Let's turn to my second case study, and here you will see how a company can enter and leave a market over a very short period of time. When I talk about Nokia, most of you will remember the name from the early days of mobile phones. Their ringtone was particularly well known, and you seemed to hear it hundreds of times per day. Nokia was a Finnish company which, back in 1871, began as a wood mill manufacturing paper near a town called Nokia in the middle of Finland. In 1896, they merged with another company in the area which made rubber boots, and in 1912, a third local company merged all under the name Nokia. The main reason for these three companies merging was locality. They were all located near each other. Their first success came with Nokia boots, which soon became very popular, and for years their name was associated with boots. In 1963, Nokia made its first steps into the telecommunications industry by developing radios for the Finnish army. This was soon followed by success manufacturing car phones. From 1998 to 2012, Nokia sold more mobile phones than any other company in the world. But they had problems moving from mobile phones to smartphones to compete with Apple and Samsung. They tried a joint venture with Microsoft, but it was not successful. And in 2013, after less than 30 years in the business, they sold their part of the business to Microsoft. These days, Nokia's core business is mobile networks. Let's now look at a company which was forced to change when their main product was no longer useful to the general public or indeed needed. This happens more often than we realized. With the arrival of the digital camera first, and then the camera on smartphones, Kodak, one of the most famous American camera companies, was forced to reinvent itself. Unfortunately, they failed. They had invented their own digital camera, but were worried that such a product would destroy their own main business, selling cameras and film and developing photos for people. Instead of switching to digital, they sold off their camera businesses, closed factories, and reduced staff numbers dramatically. They tried to focus on medical scanning equipment and commercial printers, but neither was successful. From a company which had 85% of the camera market in 1976, they ended up with practically nothing, and their shares lost all their value. So if Kodak is an example of a company which failed to reinvent, Smiths is a perfect example of reinvention. Smiths began as a jeweller in London in the 1860s, and over the next 100 years they moved from jewels to watches, and from watches to instruments, first for cars to measure speed, and then to aeroplanes to measure height. They bought a small company already in the market and developed it. They found this to be better than starting from zero in the new market. They now employ 23,000 people in 50 different countries. They are not the most famous brand in the world, but they are certainly experts at reinvention.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.